Hello, this is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt, and you're watching a lecture within the Christ School of Theology of the Institute of Lutheran Theology. We're talking today about Aristotle's life and work, and we're getting on to his work now. And of course, we could talk a very long time about this. This lecture will deal with his method, and we'll deal with his logic, okay? So, the method of Aristotle, he begins with experience, and the word here in the Greek is phenomena, which means appearance. He begins in appearance, in that that is experienced, and he looks at that which is experienced, this phenomenon, with an eye towards the puzzles that arise as we experience. And this in the Greek is aporia. The aporia is this puzzlement that we have in experience. He then looks to collect credible opinion, endoxa, about the aporia produced by the phenomena, right? So we have a puzzlement in experience. What did this guy say about this? What did this guy say about this? And what did this guy say about this? So we have to look at these various views. And then he comes to some conclusions about these aporia. Now, in general, Aristotle does not believe our knowledge about the world is a deep philosophical problem. This is unlike what is our intellectual heritage since the 17th century. We found the great questions of knowledge arising in the work of Descartes, right, who lived from 1596 to 1650. And Descartes wrote a book called The Meditations. And in this book, Descartes went out by himself and thought. And he said to himself, "Self, what if everything I think I know, I don't really know? What if all those things I hold to be true aren't really true? On this worst case scenario of everything I encounter not being true, what can I know for sure?" This was his method of methodological doubt. Brilliant method. And he wanted to build up knowledge on the firm foundations of those indubitable things, those things we cannot be wrong about. See. So for our good friend Descartes, there is a problem with the external world. We don't know if there is one. I don't know about you, but I've never found the external world. All I ever do is when I am checking out for it, I have deliverances of the senses. I have a feel or a touch or something I see with my eye or a smell or something I hear. But those are all ideas that I have, right? These are experiences that I have. And what is that out there that gives rise to the experiences? I don't know if there is an external world. I can't encounter it. Nor do I know if there are any other minds other than mine. After all, I could have the only mind because I am experiencing my mind, but you guys could all be robots. Everybody in the class here could be a robot. I don't know, right? How do I know if you have a mind? Well, it's on this basis of this doubt that Descartes then says that he proves that God exists, and God, because he's perfect, cannot be a deceiver. Therefore, our knowledge of the world that we have is pretty much like what we think it is. Now, that's a very elaborate way of going about trying to justify the reliability of your sense perceptions, right? But Descartes feels that he's been confused before, and he could be confused again. The big thing that I want you to see is that there is a problem of knowledge that Descartes points out about the external world, and that we somehow have to build a bridge, using Heidegger's terms here, to the external world in order to ascertain the truth of those things we think we know about it. This problem is not Aristotle's problem. This is the point of all of this. Aristotle pretty much assumes that there is a a tracking of truth in the phenomena we experience, right? The phenomena track truth. This sayability of things and the way things are and the way things are experienced are all in sync, right? When we reach puzzles in our experience, we must evaluate them on the basis of previous opinions, but we're not going to take this leap into skepticism and say, well, what if I don't know anything, right? Now, the more aporia that we have, according to Aristotle, the more we must look to the endoxa. We must look to those credible opinions argued, and we must adjudicate from among these various positions. Now, the rest of this lecture deals with Aristotle's logic. And generations of students learned logic from Aristotle, and then they noticed that most of the things they learned in logic from Aristotle really didn't help them much, right? Because actually, Aristotle's logic only deals with set inclusion, set disjunction, set operations, and it really doesn't capture much of the logical reasoning that we do. For instance, there's a very famous little rule, little argument form in logic. If A, then B, not B, then not A. This is called modus tollens. It's in the mode of taking away. It's taking away because we are negating the consequent of this conditional. If A, then B, not B, then not A. But really, this rule and a whole host of other rules that we operate in everyday logic, which I will call elementary propositional logic or sentential logic, this way of talking about things really isn't easy to talk about given the way that Aristotle talks about logic. Because his logic is dealing with, like I said before, sets. All A's are B, no A's are B, some A's are B, some A's are not B. Now, when Kant wrote his Kritik der reinen Vernunft in 1781. It was published in 1781. He was writing it for many years prior to that. When he wrote his Critique of Pure Reason, he was able to say that the logic that he's employing here in the deduction of the categories is basically unchanged from Aristotle's logic, because, of course, nobody's really made any advances in logic since the time of Aristotle. Now, if you think that Aristotle died in 322 BC and Kant lived in 1781, and the book came out, that is about 21 centuries between those parts. Last time I checked, Kant died roughly 2 centuries ago, right? So basically, since Kant's time to our time is about 1/10 of the time between Kant and Aristotle. So you have to see how much of the Western tradition just assumed that Aristotle was right and had said the last word on logic. In the 19th century, we had developments, Charles Sanders Peirce in America, his logic of relatives, Boolean algebra, George Boulez, and particularly the work of Frege, Gottlob Frege, in his Begriffsschrift. By the end of the 19th century, we were developing logical techniques that made use of what would be called a logic of relations, allowing us to use relations in our logic, and also what would be called now quantified logic, using quantifiers in particular ways. Quantified logic, sometimes called predicate calculus, identity, using identity, which Aristotle doesn't have either, really. So what I'm saying here is that there's been all kinds of movements forward in logic since in the last 100 years, 125 years. What I'm presenting is Aristotle's logic. I will present basically what he believed. I will not make this real scholarly by saying that this particular notion of this rule that could have been used here by Aristotle came at a particular time later in the tradition. We're going to talk about Aristotle's logic in general, and I'm going to use terms like subcontraries, and even if it wasn't completely in Aristotle, it certainly was in the tradition flowing out of it. Okay, so the thing to understand about Aristotle is that he distinguishes between universal propositions and particular propositions and affirmative propositions and denials. Okay? And the universal affirmative proposition that he comes to, of course, is all S's are P. All whales are mammals, right? And for all time, this is known as a proposition of type A. All S's are P's. Now, the denial of that is not the denial of, it's not the case that all S's are P's. That would be what we would call the denial. But he does it in a different way. He will say, no, the denial of this is no S's are P's. Right? And this is called an E proposition. Now, of course, the A proposition and the E proposition cannot both be true at the same time. It can't be true that all S's are P and no S's are P at the same time. But if you think about it very deeply, you're going to say, yes, but they can both be false at the same time. There are many positions between, all S's being P's and no S's being P's. Some S's could be P's, right? And if some S's are P's, it's not the case that all S's are P's, nor is it the case that no S's are P's, right? So they can both be false at the same time, but they both cannot be true at the same time. These are known as contraries, right? A propositions have as their contrary an E proposition. Now we go down to our particular affirmative. Now you would think particular affirmative could be John is a motion picture. That'd be a very odd thing to say, but it would be a particular proposition in sentential logic. But here, the particular proposition is going to use some S's are P, and this is called an I proposition. Okay, and then we have over here some S's are not P. Yeah, can you see that? I think you can. And this is called an O proposition. Okay? So we have A propositions, E propositions, I propositions, and O propositions. And O propositions, if you think about that, these both cannot be false at the same time, but they both could be true at the same time, right? Some S's are P's and some S's are not P's. That's easy for both of those to be true at the same time, but they can't both be false at the same time. This becomes known as a subcontrary. They are subcontraries. Now, I'm presenting to you the so-called square of opposition. And in the square of opposition, we now have these diagonals that we will fill in. And these diagonals actually trace contradictories. Now, a contradictory is different than a contrary, right? Because in a contrary, both can't be true at the same time, but both can be false at the same time. And a contradictory, if one of the terms is true, the other must be false, or if the first one is false, the other must be true. As it turns out, all S's are P contradicts some S's are not P, because if all S's are P, it cannot be the case that some S's are not P. And if all S's are P is false, it cannot be the case that some S's are not P is false. So the falsity here implies the truth here implies the falsity here here implies the truth here implies the falsity there, and the same with I and E propositions. This is the classic square of opposition. Now, what our good friend Aristotle does is, after he distinguishes these, he makes some kind of interesting points. He says that, all S's are P entails, if all S's are P, that entails that some S's are P, which is called alteration. And it's a very confusing claim if you've studied modern symbolic logic or contemporary symbolic logic, because, of course, we know in logic that all S's are P can be true and some S's are P false. Well, he said, how is that the case? Well, in logic, as we understand it, that conditional is true if P is false, right? This is true if P, then Q is true if P is true and Q is true, right? If P is true and Q is true, then if P, then Q is true. Oops. If P is true and Q is false, then it's false. But if P is false and Q is true, it's true. And if P is false and Q is false, it's true. And you're going to say, why is that the case? Well, just trust me at this point. It's got to be the case. There's a lot of reasons for it being the case. If it's not the case, logic doesn't work. It's not complete. It's you have undecidable propositions. You got all kinds of mischief going on. Anyway, we regard it standardly to be the case that a conditional is true if its antecedent is false. Okay? Well, not for Aristotle. Aristotle never seems to really think much about taking all S's as P as a vacuous claim. When he says all S are P, he's asserting that there are S's, okay? This is the so-called problem of existential import with Aristotle. We would say that Aristotle assumes existential import. That is to say that Aristotle, when he's doing his beautiful square of opposition, is assuming that there are S's, okay? So if there are S's, and all S's are P, well then certainly some S's are P, right? So for Aristotle, I follows from A, but it would not follow in modern logic without existential import. Now, what Aristotle then does is he derives rules whereby conclusions can be derived from premises validly. And here's where he gets very interesting here, because he certainly believes something like what we believe when we define validity. We say an argument form is valid, right, if it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, right? And you got to listen to what we say here. Not possible is the big point. If it's not possible, we're not saying, oh, an argument is valid if the premises are true and the conclusion is true, right? Or that the premises are true and the conclusion doesn't happen to be false. No, we have to have modal force here. We have to say an argument is valid if it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. That is, if there's no possible world in which the premises are true and the conclusion false. That is to say that an argument is valid if it is true in each and every possible world, on every conceivable assignment of truth values. If that argument comes out true, then we know it's a valid argument. Now, if you look down at the corner of your slide, you'll see the square of opposition, the so-called universal affirmative, the universal negative, the particular affirmative, and the particular negative. That's what I put on the board. Over to the right there, you can see how it was worked up in the Middle Ages. And there was a technical Latin vocabulary to cover this. Qui labit, which meant every, nullus, none. And you go down there, some, cuidabo. What I want to talk to you about, is a number of other things with our logic. If we look at our square of logic here, we are going to see that we have the A, E, I, O, and I'm going to show you how some rules can be used here to move from A to E to I to O, and show you how figures are formed and that type of thing. But I'm going to come back to you with this next lecture. So it will be lecture number 2 about Aristotle's logic, and I'll be right back with you. So thank you very much.